He bought the abandoned ranch for just $500. No one else wanted it. But beneath the crumbling fireplace, hidden under soot and stone, lay something that hadn't seen light since the Civil War. What he found wasn't just gold. It was a secret meant to stay buried. Don't skip this story. The deeper it goes, the harder it hits. Stick around. This story will change the way you see ordinary people forever. Before we begin, if stories of quiet courage, unexpected love, and everyday miracles speak to your heart, consider subscribing. One click helps us bring more of these true-to-life inspirations into the world, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Now, let's begin. The sun hadn't broken through the western Nebraska haze that morning. It just hovered, dull and pale behind a gray veil of sky, reluctant to start the day, much like Earl Whitman. He stood on the edge of the dirt road where his house had once been, boots sunk into the soft shoulder, arms crossed. All that remained now was a flattened patch of land, a muddy hole where the porch stairs had settled for 30 years, and a realtor's sign half swallowed by last night's wind. He didn't say goodbye. There wasn't anyone left to say it to. Earl had spent 42 years calling bids at livestock auctions from Cheyenne to Grand Island. He was known for a voice like gravel over diesel and a hat that never quite sat straight on his head. He was never wealthy, but he was solid, steady. And then one winter, a fast-talking man in an ironed shirt talked him into a land swap deal that promised retirement ease and wound up leaving him landless. Now, all he had was a borrowed pickup, a coffee can of loose cash, and a stubborn streak older than most trees. He drove south for 2 days, chasing silence more than anything else. Somewhere between Amarillo and Las Cruces, he stopped at a diner with cracked vinyl booths and a bulletin board pinned full of lost dogs, church suppers, and foreclosure notices. One flyer caught his eye. Tax auction, property in Dry Creek, New Mexico, minimum bid, $500. No pictures, no details, just a name that sounded like it hadn't seen rain or kindness in decades. Dry Creek. It sounded right. He arrived 3 days later after backtracking off a highway exit that no longer had a sign. The ranch was 10 miles outside of Dry Creek proper, down a 2-track road half-eaten by sand and silence. Sagebrush lined the fences like old sentries. The mailbox was missing. The gate hung from one hinge, and the house, well, it looked like it had been built to last, but hadn't expected to live quite this long. The ranch house sat squat and low on the edge of a dried-up arroyo, windows boarded or shattered, roof lines sagging like tired shoulders. The barn behind it had partially collapsed on one side, and a faded sign with the letters WR still clung to a post near the corral. Earl got out of the truck and stretched his back until it popped. He walked the perimeter of the house slowly, boots crunching over weeds and broken tiles. The land was dry, but wide. A kind of quiet that didn't just surround you, it seeped into you. Most folks would have turned right back around, but Earl didn't move. He wasn't most folks. He unlocked the door with the rusted key mailed to him in a plain envelope, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Mold, dust, and wood left to rot. It was darker inside than it should have been, even with the boarded windows. Cobwebs clung like lace to the ceiling beams. A mouse darted across the baseboard near the old wood-burning stove. Still, there was something about it. Not charm, not hope, but potential. The kind of potential born from desperation. That night, Earl laid a sleeping bag out on the floor in what must have been the living room, next to the dead fireplace. He sipped whiskey from a flask and stared at the cracked ceiling. The wind moaned through the boards, and something scratched behind the walls, but he didn't flinch. He'd heard worse sounds sleeping in auction pens and truck stops. He got up to check the fireplace, if only to feel like he was doing something. It was built from thick sandstone, mortared unevenly, the kind of work done more for function than appearance. Earl ran his hand along the stones, fingers brushing soot, grime, and spiderwebs. Then he paused. One of the stones near the bottom left corner felt different. It was smoother, slightly darker, and when he knocked on it with his knuckle, it gave a dull, hollow thunk, not the solid ring of stone that had sat untouched for 100 years. He leaned in, scraping away grime with his thumb. There was a hairline crack running along the top edge. not natural. He reached for his multi-tool and wedged the blade between the stone and mortar. With a grunt and twist, the edge budged. The stone shifted slightly forward with a dry groan, like a secret resisting being found. Dust puffed into the air. Behind the stone was a small recess, maybe the size of a shoebox. His breath caught. Inside, something glinted faintly. Earl reached in with calloused fingers and pulled out a rusted metal box. It was heavier than it looked. The latch had nearly disintegrated, and the lid opened with a reluctant creak. Inside lay a folded cloth bundle, dry and fragile. He peeled it back, revealing the worn edge of a leather-bound journal, a bronze insignia of an eagle perched on crossed swords, and beneath that, several tarnished gold coins. He stared, heart thumping slow but hard. The coins were real. He didn't know much about rare currency, but he knew gold when he saw it, and he knew old when he saw it. Each coin was marked 1863, Civil War era. What the hell had he just bought? Earl sat back, the box in his lap, the wind hissing outside like it was trying to warn him. He looked at the journal, fingers brushing the cracked leather. Someone had hidden this, on purpose, and for a long time. He glanced toward the hearth, then toward the boarded window, as if someone might be watching. Then he closed the lid, slid the box back into his duffel bag, and sat there a long time in the glow of his lantern, the weight of gold and secrets settling around him like dust. Morning came slow in Dry Creek. The sky didn't so much brighten as it did fade upward from black to pale gray. The wind had picked up overnight, and it hadn't brought rain, just more dust. Thin ribbons of grit that wove through cracked windows and settled into every crevice like ghosts staking a claim. Earl rose early, not from rest, but from habit. His body, trained by decades of sun-up auctions and cattle hauls, didn't recognize retirement. He sat on the edge of the sleeping bag, back aching, boots unlaced, and stared at the hearth like it might speak. The metal box lay on the kitchen counter now, where he'd set it after wiping it down. He hadn't touched it again since the night before. Something about it demanded patience, reverence, even. But the coffee was on now, percolating in an old enamel pot he found in a cabinet, and the smell of burnt grounds gave him the courage to face it again. He unlatched the box with a hesitant click. The journal lay atop the bundle like a folded secret. Its leather cover had darkened with time, corners frayed, the spine barely holding. He opened it carefully. The first page was blank, then the second. By the third, ink scratched across the page in a jittery hand. Lieutenant Benjamin Rourke, 3rd Cavalry, Union Army, March 1863. To whoever finds this, know that I never meant to become a thief. War made us many things, some worse than others. Earl stopped there, letting the words sit. He turned the next few pages slowly. The journal chronicled patrols along the Rio Grande, campfire rumors, supply shortages, and then a phrase that stopped him cold. Operation Scorpion begins tomorrow. We're to intercept rebel shipments moving west, confiscate and relocate all valuables per Washington orders. No questions asked. Earl leaned back, heart ticking up a notch. He may not have finished high school, but he knew a code phrase when he saw one. He closed the book and turned his attention to the other objects. The insignia was unmistakable, a Union Eagle badge, the kind pinned on officers' hats or lapels. It was pitted and dulled, but its wings still stretched proudly. Beneath it, 6 gold coins, each about the size of a $50. Their surfaces were worn, but clearly marked with CSA, Confederate States of America, and the date 1863. Earl let out a low whistle. He'd heard of collectors paying thousands for just one of these. He picked one up. It was warm in his hand, heavy with something more than weight. History, maybe. Guilt, even. The last item in the box was a folded canvas cloth wrapped in brittle oil paper. Inside was a field map, sketched in charcoal, creased so many times it nearly tore. It showed a ridgeline marked Red Mesa, a squiggle for the river, and what looked like coordinates written in faded ink. 2 hands west of the Twin Cypress. Dig deep. He had no idea what it meant, but his land backed up against a bluff with red rock outcroppings that locals had called Blood Ridge. Probably the same thing, renamed over time. Dry Creek had a habit of swallowing its history like it swallowed rain. By noon, Earl had made a decision. He repacked the box, except for the journal, and placed it under a loose board in the pantry. No need to advertise. He didn't know who might come snooping in a place like this, but secrets had a smell, and people could sniff them out when money was involved. He grabbed an old atlas from the truck and spread it across the kitchen table. Dry Creek wasn't even on the main map, just a faint dot on a secondary road, like a forgotten punctuation mark. He found Red Mesa Ridge about 5 miles southwest of his property line, too far for the journal writer to have stumbled across by accident. He flipped through the journal again, this time reading further. Rourke's entries grew darker, more personal. He wrote about the weight of stealing from men already doomed, about burying gold in the night under cover of cannon fire. One line stood out. I buried what I could before they turned on me. One man cannot serve God, country, and conscience at once. I chose none. The last entry was dated April 2nd, 1863. Then nothing. No mention of recovery. No signal to others. Just a hole in the ground and a haunted conscience. That evening, Earl drove into town for the first time since arriving. Dry Creek was smaller than he remembered from passing through years ago. A gas station, a diner, a post office that hadn't had a flag in over a decade. The general store still had a wooden Indian out front, though time and sun had warped its face into something half sad, half angry. Earl kept his errands short: duct tape, bottled water, and some jerky. But the clerk, a wiry woman in her 60s named Doreen, looked him over with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. You the fella bought the W.R. place? She asked without looking up from the register. Earl nodded. Didn't think anyone would take that land. Hasn't been touched since '82. Folks say it's cursed. Earl gave a half grin. I don't scare easy. Doreen handed him his change and leaned in just a bit. You should. Back at the ranch, the wind had died down, replaced by a silence so full it seemed to press on the walls. Earl sat by the fireplace again, journal in his lap, a single kerosene lantern lighting the room in soft amber. He flipped to the back of the book. Tucked into a slit along the inside cover was one more item he hadn't noticed earlier, a fragment of a military dispatch, orders typed in formal language, stained with what looked like old water damage. Operation Scorpion is to remain off record. Recovery teams will report directly to Treasury Liaison. Recovered assets to be funneled through Southern Pacific channels. Earl blinked. Treasury, Southern Pacific. This wasn't just stolen gold. This was something orchestrated, hidden, and buried not just in dirt, but in bureaucracy. He sat back and exhaled long, staring into the cold hearth, now cleaner, but no less mysterious. Somewhere beneath this land was more than just relics. There was truth, and maybe blood, and maybe, if he wasn't careful, trouble. But Earl Whitman wasn't the kind of man to turn his back on something once he'd put his hands in it, especially not when the fireplace that had warmed 1,000 forgotten nights had just whispered something through stone and ash. Keep digging. The next morning brought a different kind of silence, not the natural stillness of the desert, but the kind that follows a decision. Earl hadn't slept much. His body had curled around the metal box beneath the floorboard, like a dog guarding a bone. Something in him had shifted. He wasn't just a man, living out the rest of his years on forgotten land. Now he was a man who had found something. But knowing what he had found, that was going to take help. He didn't like asking for it. Never had. But what lay in that journal, those gold coins and that map, that wasn't just old war junk. It was part of a story he wasn't equipped to tell alone. He waited until the town library opened, which wasn't saying much. It only opened 3 days a week and didn't have Wi-Fi. The librarian, a woman in her 80s named Miss Althea, wore a pair of thick-rimmed glasses on a chain around her neck and seemed surprised anyone had come through the door. He asked for books on the Civil War in New Mexico. She pointed to the second shelf in the far back corner without standing up. Earl scanned through a few worn titles before pulling one that had a yellow post-it inside the cover. Donated by M. Tate, 2022. Marley Tate. He remembered the name. It was on a piece of paper he'd seen stuck to the bulletin board outside the general store, Independent historian available for research, transcription, or story consulting. Specializing in Civil War lore. Call Marley. Below it, a phone number scrawled in faded ink and a smiley face drawn on a musket ball. He called from the payphone outside. When she answered, her voice was bright and clipped, like someone used to dodging telemarketers and old men trying to quiz her about Gettysburg. But when Earl mentioned the journal and the coins, her tone changed. She arrived 2 hours later in a dusty blue Subaru packed with crates of books and a box labeled Ballistics Misc. Her boots were scuffed, and her canvas satchel had patches from half a dozen reenactment festivals. She stepped out, looked at the ranch, and squinted at Earl. "You sure you didn't just dream this up?" she asked, nodding toward the cracked porch. Earl didn't answer. He just handed her the journal. She sat on the hood of her car and read silently for 15 minutes. Then she looked up, a slow whistle escaping her lips. "Where the hell did you get this?" He motioned toward the house. "Fireplace. Hidden cavity. You believe it?" She flipped through the pages. "I've seen a lot of fakes. This isn't one. Ink's right. Paper's degraded but intact. These entries, these names, they match nothing I've seen in records, which is exactly what makes it interesting." She pointed to the map tucked in the back. "This sketch, it matches a field drawing from the Battle of Valverde. That little X there, that's not just any ridge. That's Red Mesa." "I figured." "Where the hell is this land?" she asked. Earl pointed west. "All around us." Inside, she handled the coins like someone used to reverence. She used gloves, even though Earl had already smudged them up. "These are Confederate mints, yes. But this insignia here," she pointed to a faint engraving. "This isn't just decoration. It's military issue, minted at the Dahlonega Mint in Georgia. Extremely rare." He watched her closely. "You think it's real?" "I know it's real. What I don't know is why it's buried here." She set down the coin and pulled a notebook from her bag. "Have you heard of Operation Scorpion?" Earl shook his head. "I hadn't either, not until last year. It was a rumor, a whisper in some of the correspondence between Northern officers. Supposedly, a covert plan approved by Treasury agents to intercept gold moving through rebel channels in the West. But every time I found a lead, the trail went cold." She flipped open a file folder. "Some believe the gold never made it east, that it was hidden, laundered, or, worse, used to fund post-war land speculation. Railroads, banks, you name it." She paused. "You might be sitting on the missing link." Earl frowned. "That make me lucky or dead?" She didn't answer right away. "Depends on how loud you plan to talk about it." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the attic, sifting through rat droppings, spider webs, and collapsed ceiling beams. Earl hadn't gone up there since he moved in. He'd half expected the floor to cave beneath him. Marley spotted it first, a rolled-up canvas tube shoved between the rafters. It cracked when she unrolled it. Inside was a large parchment map, drawn in black ink, labeled in tight calligraphy. "Property acquisitions, Southwest Territories, 1864. Dozens of plots were circled, many of them with notations in Latin. But one stood out, highlighted in faded red chalk. Parcel 7B, WR Holdings. "Your ranch," she said, "was part of something bigger." Beneath the parcel note was a stamped emblem Earl hadn't seen before, two clasped hands over a sheaf of wheat with the initials DFC, Department of Federal Commerce, Marley said, predecessor to the modern Treasury. Earl leaned back, letting the dust settle. "So I didn't just buy an old ranch for $500. "No," she said quietly. "You bought the last surviving piece of a ghost operation that probably never should have existed." That night, Earl stared at the map until the lines blurred into shapes. Marley slept in the truck, curled in the back seat with a book over her face. He didn't blame her. The house still creaked like it remembered things better left forgotten. Before bed, he placed the journal under his pillow, not for safety, but for connection. The man who wrote it was no longer just a name. Benjamin Rourke had lived, fought, stolen, hid, and now, all these years later, whispered through ink. Earl lay in the dark, hand resting on the journal's cracked spine. Outside, the wind picked up again, and with it came the faint, distant sound of something shifting underground, stone against stone, like the past turning in its sleep. The desert doesn't carry sound the same way the city does. In places like Dry Creek, every word spoken outside seems to hang in the air longer than it should, clinging to wind and fences, bouncing off dry barn wood like it's searching for ears. Which is exactly why Earl Whitman should have known better than to ask questions in public. He wasn't looking to stir up trouble. He just needed supplies. A few tools, some PVC piping, maybe a cheap soil probe if they had one in stock. The journal had mentioned digging. Earl didn't know how deep or wide, but he knew he couldn't use his bare hands, and the Fireplace stones weren't going to give up the rest of their secrets without a little help. So he'd made the drive into town with Marley the following morning. She suggested they split up. He'd head to the hardware store, she'd swing by the county records office and try to find the original deed for Parcel 7B. The store was a squat tan building with a tin roof and a sagging front porch, the kind of place that had sold the same nails and the same coffee cans since 1963. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of motor oil and cedar shavings. An old country song hummed low on the radio behind the register. Earl walked the aisles slowly, grabbing what he needed, nodding politely to the two other customers. When he approached the counter, he recognized the clerk. Boyd, maybe late 30s, the kind of man who wore his ball cap low and his opinions lower. Earl had seen him before, back when he'd first arrived. Boyd hadn't said much then, but now his eyes narrowed. "Digging something up out there?" he asked, nodding to the pile of tools. Earl shrugged. "Just fixing the place up. Ground's not been kind to it." Boyd scratched his beard. "Funny, heard you were asking about old maps, water tables, buried structures. I like to know what I'm standing on." "Sure," Boyd smirked. "Some folks say you found something." Earl didn't blink. "I found a bad roof and a rattlesnake under the sink." That should have been the end of it, but as Earl turned to leave, Boyd added casually, "You know the W.R. place used to belong to a fella named Louis Daltrey. Died in '82, never married, no heirs." Earl paused. So no one's lived there since. That land's been passed over more times than a dry well. Now you show up, nosing around, asking about the Civil War?" The air between them stiffened. Earl gave a tight nod, lifted his bag, and walked out without another word. By the time he got back to the truck, Marley was already waiting. Her face was pale. "I found something," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. "The parcel records from 1864. There's a discrepancy. The land was assigned to a W.R. Holdings company, same as the map. But in the 1920s, the name disappears. The file's been redacted." "Redacted?" "Stamped over, replaced. There's a microfiche record showing federal inspection activity out there in 1921, but no report." Earl started the truck. "Let's go. I think I already kicked the hornet's nest." They returned to the ranch by noon, the wind whipping harder now. The clouds hung low and yellow in the sky. A storm was coming, not of weather, but of whispers. That night, while Marley combed through scanned documents and tried to trace the holdings company through court filings, Earl stepped out to check the perimeter. That's when he saw the glint. At first, he thought it was the moon catching a bottle. But as he moved closer to the south fence line, he realized it was metal. Not just metal, glass. A small drone hovered motionless above the far field, blinking silently. Then, as if sensing him, it buzzed away into the hills. Earl stood still, jaw tight. He'd never liked tech, never trusted it. Now it felt like it was watching him. The next morning, the mail came early, which was strange. Even stranger, the mail truck didn't drive up the lane. The box, which hadn't been checked in weeks, had a single manila envelope inside, unmarked, no postage. Marley opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were photographs. Grainy, black and white. One showed a man in a Union officer's coat standing beside a chest. Another showed two men digging near what appeared to be a rock outcrop. But the final image was modern, too modern. It was a photo of Earl taken from a distance. He was standing by the fireplace, holding the journal. There was no note, no explanation. Just a matchbook tucked into the envelope with the logo, Gila Ridge Motel, Room 5. "I don't like this," Marley said, her voice tight. Someone wants us to know we're being watched. Earl said nothing. He was staring at the photo of himself. Someone had been close enough to see inside the house. He checked the windows, the locks, the loose boards in the pantry, but they hadn't taken anything. They didn't need to. They were just saying hello. Later that afternoon, a white pickup rolled up the drive. The man who stepped out wore jeans too clean for a working man and boots that hadn't seen a mile of dirt. His button-up was crisp, tucked tight, and he carried a clipboard like a weapon. "Mr. Whitman?" he asked, smiling too easily. "I'm Randall Briggs, land inspector. County sent me to verify some property lines." Earl didn't shake his hand. "We didn't file for any inspection." Briggs shrugged. "Sometimes it's routine. Reassessment year. Just need a few signatures." He looked past Earl toward the barn, the fields, the house. "Lot of history out here, huh?" Earl crossed his arms. "You looking for something specific?" Briggs smiled wider. "Just boundaries, Mr. Whitman. Just boundaries." Earl didn't sign a thing. Briggs didn't press. He just tipped his hat, turned, and left as quickly as he came. But Earl watched his taillights disappear down the road, a heavy knot in his stomach. That night, the generator went out. No storm, no wind, just silence, followed by darkness. Earl walked outside with his flashlight and found the casing had been removed. Wires snipped, clean. This wasn't nature. This was a warning. They slept lightly. Marley kept the pistol close. Earl left the porch light off and sat by the hearth until dawn, his eyes scanning the dark. The land around him had been silent when he arrived. But now, it was talking. And whatever it was trying to say, it wasn't done yet. Dry Creek awoke that morning, under a low, bruised sky, the kind that threatened rain but rarely delivered. Earl stepped out onto the porch and scanned the horizon, nothing but endless stretches of baked earth and brittle sage, but he knew better than to trust a quiet morning anymore. Silence here didn't mean safety. It meant something was watching, waiting. Inside, Marley hunched over the kitchen table, the journal open next to a stack of Xeroxed court records and territorial maps from the 1860s. Her eyes were bleary, her hair pulled back in a tight knot of focus and fatigue. "I think I found it," she said, not looking up. "Found what?" She tapped the journal. "This passage here. It mentions a false hearth and hollow board beneath the heart of the fire. And here." She slid over a floor plan she'd found in an old zoning archive. The fireplace isn't on the original blueprint. It was added later. "You think there's something under it?" "I'd bet on it." Earl didn't hesitate. He grabbed the pry bar. They started by clearing the ashes. Marley brought over the shop vac she'd dug out from the barn, and Earl braced himself against the stonework as he began testing the floor with the heel of his boot. The boards thudded in rhythm until one gave back a slightly different sound, a subtle, almost imperceptible echo. He knelt, pried up the board, and revealed a pocket of black beneath it. Dirt, packed hard, with flecks of rusted metal and splinters of something charred. He pulled back more planks. The cavity stretched nearly 6 feet across and 3 feet deep. They retrieved the metal detector Marley had borrowed from the Santa Fe University's archaeology department, and when she swept it across the opening, the thing nearly screamed. They exchanged a look. Then they started digging. It took 2 hours to reach it. A rotted wooden crate sealed with strips of leather and iron nails rusted into powder. The wood had warped over time, and the lid cracked under Earl's grip, splitting like dry bone. Inside lay objects that didn't belong together, but somehow made perfect sense in this place. Stacks of brittle Civil War-era currency, greenbacks and Confederate notes alike, bundled with string, a silver-plated pistol with ornate engravings, its barrel still oiled, and a collection of coins that gleamed in the lantern light like old teeth. But beneath those, tucked carefully in a waxed envelope, was a sealed letter, its front marked in delicate penmanship. To the United States Treasury Department. Confidential, 1865. Earl stared. Marley's hands trembled as she took it, held it up to the light. This shouldn't exist. If it's what I think it is, this might be the only surviving link between wartime looting and post-war financial fraud. She opened it gently, unfolding the thick parchment. Inside was a detailed confession, written in tight, lawyerly script. A Union lieutenant, Rourke again, confessing to intercepting Confederate gold under orders from Treasury officials. But it didn't stop there. The letter claimed the gold had been laundered through land grants and then funneled into railroad stocks and early banking houses, in the names of those same officials. They didn't just hide the gold, Marley whispered. They turned it into generational wealth. Whole families today, maybe banks, corporations, could trace their roots to this fraud. Earl sat back, rubbing his temples. Jesus, he muttered. All this time, buried in a box under a fireplace, nobody looked twice at. Marley was silent, staring at the pistol. There's blood on this story, she said finally. And I don't just mean metaphorical. Whoever buried this didn't want it found. And if someone knew we were getting close. She didn't finish the thought. They both knew how deep this went. That night, Earl couldn't sleep. The storm outside finally broke loose, wind lashing against the shutters, rain tapping like cautious fingers against the roof. But even as thunder rolled across the mesa, Earl's thoughts were louder. He thought about the drone, about Randall Briggs and his clipboard smile, about the photo of him holding the journal. He rose from bed and walked barefoot through the dark house. He found himself in the living room, staring into the now gutted fireplace. It looked hollow, like a ribcage with the heart removed. The box was in the back room now, covered with a blanket. He lifted the corner and stared at the letter again. The gold belongs to the country. But the truth belongs to the people. The words weren't in the letter, but they hung in the air just the same. He knew what he had to do. By morning, Marley had contacted an old colleague, a Civil War scholar named Dr. Lionel Bryce at the University of Denver. She explained what they'd found. At first, he didn't believe her. Then she sent photos. His reply was simple. Keep everything secure. I'm on my way. That same morning, Earl walked the perimeter again. The drone hadn't returned, but something else had. Tire tracks. Fresh ones, deep in the mud near the south fence, leading to nowhere. Someone had been close. Again. He followed the tracks until they vanished at the edge of the ridge. The silence was deeper than before. He felt the change before he saw it. The air, cooler, denser. He turned slowly and noticed something he hadn't before, an old stump near the edge of the pasture. It looked like any other weathered remains of a mesquite tree until he noticed the stone next to it, flat, rectangular, almost like a marker. He brushed it clean. No name, no dates, just an engraving, a Union insignia. And beneath it, 3 words, nearly worn away by wind and time. He buried truth. Earl stood there for a long time, the wind curling around him like a memory. Then he turned and walked back to the house. They weren't just digging up history anymore. They were unearthing a war that had never really ended. By the time Dr. Lionel Bryce arrived at the ranch 2 days later, the sky had turned the color of a loaded storm. His arrival was unceremonious. A rental car coated in highway grime, a single battered suitcase, and a brief nod as he stepped out into the dust. Earl, he said, extending a hand, thanks for not calling the FBI, yet. Earl, standing on the porch with a mug of burnt coffee, didn't smile. Not yet, he agreed. Come inside. Dr. Bryce was a tall, lean man with silver hair pulled back into a low knot, the look of a professor who had once been radical but now played diplomat. He wore a threadbare blazer and desert boots, the kind of outfit that tried to blend in and failed. Inside, Marley had laid everything out: photos, scans, the original journal, the coins, and the sealed treasury letter under protective film. Bryce moved through the evidence like a man inspecting a cathedral. This is real, he muttered, flipping through Rourke's journal. And it's not just real. It's dangerous. Do you know what this implicates? We're starting to get the picture, Marley said, arms folded. But you're here because we don't know the whole frame. Bryce nodded slowly. You've stumbled into the shadow ledger of America's financial history. Operation Scorpion wasn't just about intercepting Confederate wealth. It was about laundering it, feeding it into the veins of post-war capitalism, railroads, land corporations, national banks. He turned to Earl. And this land, your ranch, was part of the mechanism, a literal ground zero for moving illegal gold into legitimate hands. Earl didn't flinch. And now those hands want it buried again. Bryce glanced at the window. You're not wrong. The deeper this goes, the more it threatens legacy families, institutions, even foundations still operating today. That was when they heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV rolled slowly up the driveway. No markings, no plates. The kind of car that didn't belong in a town like Dry Creek. When the doors opened, two men stepped out. Clean suits, dark ties, short haircuts that screamed federal, though no badges were visible. And then came the third, Randall Briggs, still smiling. Mr. Whitman, he called out, voice syrupy sweet. We're back to finalize that inspection. Earl stepped off the porch slowly, one hand just brushing the butt of the revolver tucked into the back of his waistband. Marley and Bryce followed behind, quiet but alert. Briggs stopped 10 feet away. Now, I understand there's been some confusion about your rights, about who owns what. I'm here to clear that up. You're trespassing, Earl said flatly. Briggs didn't blink. The Department of Interior has a vested interest in any materials discovered on federally associated property. According to archive reinstatements filed last week, Parcel 7B reverted back to holding under administrative claim in 1942. So, technically, you're squatting on federal land. Funny, Earl said. The deed I signed didn't say that. Briggs smiled wider. Paperwork is a flexible thing. One of the suited men stepped forward. We're prepared to offer you a settlement for immediate release of the property and contents. No lawsuits, no publicity. Cash Earl's jaw tightened. Not for sale. Briggs nodded like he expected the answer. Sometimes it's best, he said, to let history stay buried. That fireplace, that letter, it's not your burden to carry. Earl didn't move. It is now. Briggs held the stare for a long beat, then turned, motioning to the others. We'll be in touch, he said, climbing into the SUV. As the car backed down the drive, Marley let out a low breath. They're not giving up. No, Bryce said quietly. They're just getting started. That night, the barn burned. It happened fast. A low whoosh, followed by a wall of fire that danced high against the black sky. Earl and Marley rushed outside, boots thudding against the dry earth, but it was already too late. Flames licked the rafters, cracked beams groaned under the heat, and black smoke rolled toward the stars. Earl grabbed the garden hose and sprayed helplessly at the edges. Marley dialed 911, shouting into the receiver. Bryce ran to the truck to grab fire extinguishers, but it was all theater. The barn, old, dry, weary, gave in like it was ready. By the time the Dry Creek fire truck arrived, a battered engine run by 2 volunteers, the blaze had reduced half the structure to glowing coals. One of the firefighters, an older man in a torn jacket, walked the perimeter with Earl as they waited for the flames to die. Funny thing, the firefighter said. No lightning, no wind, just up and lit. You find anything? Earl asked. The man hesitated. Gasoline traces, but probably just old fuel cans catching spark, right? Earl didn't respond. In the smoldering morning, they surveyed the damage. The barn was gutted, tools lost. One of the exterior walls scorched down to skeletal framing. But somehow, the floor over the underground chamber had survived. The fire hadn't reached the vault. They wanted to destroy what they thought was there, Marley said. Or they wanted to send a message. Bryce nodded grimly. This is how cover-ups are enforced, not through courts, through fear. Earl stood silent for a long time. Then he turned to Marley. I'm done hiding this. You sure? Yeah, he said. If they want to fight, they picked the wrong patch of dirt. They spent the rest of the day documenting everything. Photos, videos, witness logs. Bryce called a contact in the historical preservation legal community, one that specialized in contested property law and war-era assets. Marley began drafting a press release, not for national distribution, not yet, just enough to reach the right eyes. That evening, Earl sat by the rebuilt fireplace, scorched boots propped up on an overturned milk crate, and reread Rourke's final journal entry. to die with truth beneath your boots is still a kind of justice. He lit a match, held it up to the old stone, and watched the shadows dance. They had stirred up something ancient, and now it was awake. The fire may have gutted the barn, but it lit something else in Earl Whitman. Maybe it was rage, maybe it was resolve, but the smoke hadn't even cleared before he decided that whatever was under that ranch, secrets, sin, gold, or ghost, wasn't staying buried anymore. The wind that swept over Dry Creek that morning was hot and restless. It kicked up dust from the mesquite roots and flung it against the windows like the land itself had something to say. Marley stood at the edge of the barn's remains with a clipboard and camera, documenting every blackened board and twisted nail. Dr. Bryce crouched by the foundation, studying scorch marks with the eye of someone used to tracing intent through ashes. They weren't archaeologists, not really, but today they would dig like ones. The map they'd found in the attic, the one hidden in the old canvas roll, showed more than they realized at first. Marley, after a long night comparing it to Civil War troop movements, had discovered something curious. A faint inked X, not under the barn itself, but slightly south, near where the foundation extended into the dry rock. That morning, as Earl cleared the charred remains of the tool shed, his shovel struck something hard. Not stone, not wood. A flat echo, like metal hidden under layers of earth. He froze. "Marley," he called, "you might want to see this." It took 2 hours, careful digging, and a borrowed crowbar, but by noon they uncovered it. A rusted hatch buried under 6 inches of packed soil. It had no markings except a half-erased engraving near the hinge, USM, and the number 412. U.S. Marshals, Bryce muttered. Unit designations from Reconstruction era. This was buried after the war. Marley brushed dust off her jeans. They were hiding their own crimes. The hatch groaned open with a metallic sigh, like something exhaling from 100 years underground. Inside was a descending tunnel, only about 10 feet deep, reinforced with timber beams blackened with age but still intact. They climbed down, one by one, lanterns in hand, breath held against the smell of mildew and old iron. At the bottom, they found a low concrete chamber. The floor was damp, and mold clung to the walls like cobwebs. But stacked along the far end were 5 wooden crates, stamped with the same USM insignia. Each one sealed, each one waiting. Earl pulled the lid off the first crate. Inside, stacks of leather-bound folders, brittle with age but astonishingly well-preserved. He pulled one free and opened it carefully. Inside were typed documents, formal, cold, and devastating. Land transfer records, names, coordinates, and handwritten annotations in red ink, referencing Operation Clayroot. Marley stared at the name. "I've heard of this," she whispered. It was rumored to be a post-war program to resettle families, but there were rumors that it was used to funnel money and land into the hands of loyalists, northern elites, railroad men. Dr. Bryce opened another crate. Inside, black and white photographs, grainy and haunting. Soldiers standing by train cars loaded with crates. Men shaking hands at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Families being escorted off their land under armed supervision. This wasn't just about gold, he said. It was about erasing people, whole communities. They worked in silence, crate by crate, until the floor around them was littered with paper, tin boxes, and ledger sheets that told a story no textbook had ever dared to print. Earl sat back against the wall, his face pale. "I bought this land thinking it was a last shot, a joke even. But it wasn't. It was chosen, buried on purpose." Marley nodded. "And now you're the only person who can bring it up." They returned to the house and began scanning everything they could. Marley's laptop ran hot from the load. Bryce dictated field notes into a recorder. Earl, tired but alert, stood by the window watching for any sign of Briggs or his silent suits. Later that evening, Marley posted the first article on her blog, Operation Clayroot, What the Government Forgot to Bury. An ex-livestock auctioneer, a freelance historian, and a university scholar have uncovered what may be the most significant Civil War-era conspiracy in the American Southwest. She didn't name the location, not yet, but the story traveled anyway. Within an hour, independent history forums picked it up. Within 6, a few fringe journalists shared it. Then, it started trending on a single hashtag, #truth in the dust. The next morning brought silence. Not peace, just the kind of quiet that follows impact, until the knock at the door. It was Linda Arellano Grace, a journalist from Amarillo, whose great-grandfather had vanished during a land dispute in 1871. "I saw the post," she said, "and I know this place. My family used to ranch out past Red Mesa. We were run off when the government surveyed the boundary. I want in." She spoke like someone who'd waited her whole life for someone else to dig up her ghosts. Earl looked at Marley, then nodded. "Come on in. Hope you like dust." They gave her everything, files, maps, even the journal. Linda's eyes lit up with the hunger of someone who still believed journalism could save something. That night, her article dropped on an independent investigative site. Did rural New Mexico help hide America's greatest financial cover-up? It exploded. The comments came fast. Then came the calls. Former landowners, descendants of Union officers, people who had heard the whispers for generations, and now, finally, had a place to send them. The ranch was no longer a footnote. It was now ground zero. Later, Earl sat on the porch with Bryce, staring at the stars. "Think we can keep this up?" Earl asked. "Depends." "On what?" "On how many people decide the truth is worth more than gold." A gust of wind carried the smell of mesquite and burned timber across the ranch. Somewhere out in the hills, a coyote howled. Earl didn't flinch. They weren't done yet. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was standing on cursed ground. He felt like he was standing on history, and this time, it had a voice. The days following the discovery of the second vault turned grim, not just in tone, but in weather, in air, in silence. The dry wind that once swept across Earl's ranch with an open sky now felt closer, heavier, as if the land knew it was being watched. Earl noticed it first, not in the obvious ways, but in the small ones. The stray boot prints near the barn, ruins that didn't belong to any of them. The occasional glint on the hillside from something metallic, unmoving. A drone buzzed once and didn't return. That afternoon, the quiet was almost too clean. No birds, no breeze, just dust and waiting. Then the sheriff came. Kenny Doyle didn't bother calling ahead. His cruiser crunched up the driveway around noon, stopping near the gate with deliberate stillness. He climbed out slower than necessary, his boots finding the dirt like he meant to plant something in it. Earl was already on the porch, arms crossed. He didn't offer coffee. Doyle didn't ask for any. Inside, Marley had paused her scans mid-process. Dr. Bryce had stepped out back to take a call, but re-entered when he saw Doyle's vehicle. The air in the house cooled a few degrees just by the sheriff's presence. There were no greetings, no questions. Just a long moment of standing, watching, listening to the hum of the hard drive, the ceiling fan, and the weight in Doyle's eyes. His gaze drifted to the table, where documents and photographs lay scattered like evidence from a forgotten trial. Doyle didn't speak until the silence thickened. Then, flat and practiced, "You need to stop." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a threat. It was the tone of a man too tired to pretend the law was still just. A man whose badge had become a burden long ago. Earl didn't answer, didn't have to. The sheriff's eyes lingered on the window, then turned back. No explanations, no clarifications, just a parting line before he walked out the door. Some things were never meant to be found. He left no dust behind. That night, the warning became something more. Marley's car was parked beneath the cedar tree, where the shade protected it from most things, except sharp steel, 4 slashed tires, the kind of clean work that spoke of practice, not passion, the kind of thing done by someone who didn't care if they were seen. Earl found the mailbox an hour later, smashed in, wood splinters scattered across the ditch like teeth. No note, no message. But the silence roared. Rosalia came by the next morning. She hadn't visited since the article dropped, but something in the air had changed, and she felt it in her bones. Her steps were slower, her eyes tired in that ancestral way, like they had seen too much too long ago and still carried the knowing. She didn't ask questions, didn't wait to be invited. She simply sat on the porch beside Earl, her shawl flapping in the wind, her hands still and folded. "There was a time," she murmured, "when this land was loud with truth, until someone decided silence paid better." Earl nodded once. That was all. Linda Grace received her warning in a different form, a photograph, slid under her motel door sometime after midnight. It showed her daughter, walking home from school. Not hurt, not approached, just seen, watched, tracked. The back of the photo bore nothing but an address, Marley's P.O. box, where she had sent off the first batch of evidence. By sunrise, Linda was at the ranch. She didn't knock. Inside, her hands shook as she laid the photo on the kitchen table. Marley stared at it. Bryce swallowed hard. Earl didn't move. They all knew what it meant. The silence was cracking, and whoever had kept it in place all these years wasn't willing to let it fall without consequence. The day passed without a word from Doyle. No patrols, no calls. The sheriff's absence was louder than his presence had ever been, and still, they worked, sorting files, copying maps, scanning letters. Bryce filed a legal claim with a historical foundation known for protecting controversial finds. Marley drafted her second article. Linda started collecting witness statements from families who had quietly reached out in the last 48 hours. Every hour brought another email, another name, another thread. Families displaced, land seized, records changed. Earl's ranch was no longer a story. It was a mirror, and the reflections weren't flattering. That afternoon, the wind shifted again. It brought with it an envelope, delivered by courier, government seal, clean, precise. Inside, a cease and desist notice signed by an assistant director from the Department of the Interior. Cold, legal language. Direct orders to stop all excavation, cataloging, and dissemination of recovered materials pending formal review under federal code. No threats, just paperwork. But Earl had read enough lies on government letterhead to know when paper was louder than bullets. He passed it to Bryce, who read it twice and set it aside without comment. "They're scared," he finally said, "not of the gold, of the story." "They should be," Marley replied. Rosalia returned that night, walking the pasture barefoot. She said her father had told her this land once echoed with songs, before fences and boundaries, before documents and banks. She knelt beside the burned scar where the barn had stood and whispered a prayer in Spanish. Not for protection, for reckoning. That night, Earl sat alone beside the old fireplace. He held Rourke's journal in one hand, the sealed treasury letter in the other. The fire crackled, but the house felt colder than it had in weeks. He didn't speak, didn't read. He just listened. To the floorboards, to the rafters, to the wind pressing against the glass like it remembered too much. The silence had always been there, but now, for the first time, it was afraid. There was something sacred about Red Mesa, not in the church and hymns kind of way, but in the way the land refused to forget. Wind cut sharper there, and the sandstone glowed like it held memories in its bones. Earl had seen the mesa 100 times before, but now it loomed differently, no longer just a landscape, but a witness. It was Linda who suggested the press conference. "We can't wait for the law to catch up," she said. "We have to show people what we've found. Let the world decide if it matters." So they chose Red Mesa. Not for drama, but for what it symbolized. It was the backdrop to the maps in the journal, the silent ridge in Rourke's sketches. If history had a heartbeat in this place, Red Mesa was its echo chamber. They gathered everything: photos, documents, digital scans, even Rourke's Union insignia. Bryce worked through the night building a timeline of events, connecting dots across generations. Marley reached out to universities, archivists, and civil liberties attorneys. Earl, quiet and steady, prepared the land. He leveled a patch of dirt, hammered in tent stakes, and mounted a single American flag in the center. By sunrise, the press vans began to arrive. The air buzzed with tension, though nothing violent had happened yet. Still, they all felt it, like standing on a frozen lake, unsure where the next crack might appear. Dr. Bryce stepped forward first, calm, composed, scholarly. He recounted the historical context, laid out the findings, and gave weight to the documents. Then Marley spoke. her voice firmer than usual, recounting the coded pages in Rourke's journal and the map hidden in Earl's attic. She held up one of the coins, gold, tarnished by time, but glinting nonetheless. And then Earl stepped up to the microphone. He wore his old auctioneer's hat, not out of nostalgia, but defiance. The breeze caught the brim as he looked over the crowd, journalists, skeptics, historians, and a few locals who'd come out of curiosity or guilt. "I was raised to believe that land tells the truth," he began, "even if people don't." He paused. "My name's Earl Whitman. I'm no hero. I'm no outlaw either. I bought this ranch because it was cheap and nobody else wanted it. And I found something under it, a story this country buried because it didn't fit the one they wanted to tell." He laid the sealed treasury envelope on the podium. "Gold's not the treasure here. The treasure is what this letter says about who we are and what we chose to forget." There were no theatrics, no applause, just a solemn weight in the stillness after he stepped back. The article dropped that afternoon. Linda published it on 3 platforms simultaneously. Title: Red Mesa Files, the buried scandal that funded post-war power. It went viral within hours. Clips of Earl's speech made the evening news. Comment sections erupted, some calling him a patriot, others a hoaxer. Political pundits latched onto it. Civil War reenactors and historical societies launched their own investigations. A university in Chicago offered to carbon date the contents of the crates. Marley was asked to lecture. Bryce received threats and invitations in the same breath, and then came the legal firestorm. The following week, a federal injunction arrived by courier. The Department of the Interior demanded immediate cessation of all excavations and issued a temporary seizure of all materials on the property. Armed agents arrived the next morning, not many, but enough to make a statement. Earl watched from the porch as they approached. "You Whitman?" He nodded. "Step aside, sir. This is now federal jurisdiction." Bryce stepped forward with a packet of counterfilings. "He's filed an injunction of his own, based on the National Historic Preservation Act, Article 4, Section 106. You're trespassing on a potential heritage site." The lead agent glanced at the papers, then at the camera crews now circling the gate. "This isn't over," he muttered. "No," Earl said. "It's just starting." The story refused to die. More people came forward. Families from Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, descendants of settlers who'd lost land during the Reconstruction, resettlements. Some brought letters, others brought photos. All carried silence heavy on their backs, now lightened by the chance to be heard. A particularly fragile letter arrived from a 92-year-old man in Virginia. His grandfather, a freedman and Union soldier, had kept a journal. The last entry mentioned being sent to New Mexico under mysterious orders. He was never seen again. "I think your story is my family's story," the letter read. In the days that followed, Earl's ranch became something else. Not a battleground, not a shrine, but a reckoning place. University vans rolled in alongside pickup trucks. Old ranchers stood next to city professors, both staring down at the fire-scorched soil like it could answer questions. And through it all, Earl stayed steady. He fixed the back fence, rehung the door to the root cellar, cleaned up the last of the charred barn boards. History was a weight, but work kept his spine straight. On the 3rd night, he climbed the mesa alone. The stars above Red Mesa didn't blink. He stood at the edge and looked down at the flat, dusty sprawl of Dry Creek. Somewhere in that darkness, Sheriff Doyle still sat silent. Somewhere in that black wind, Briggs was still waiting. Somewhere deeper, maybe, the land remembered every lie that had ever been shoveled into it. But Earl was done with burying. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, not with the usual government courier or federal vehicle, but folded neatly inside a sealed envelope left under the rusted horseshoe by Earl's front gate. No tire marks in the dirt, no footprints. Just white paper with the emblem of the U.S. Department of the Treasury embossed in gold. Marley found it. She didn't speak, just handed it to Earl like it might be ticking. Inside was a summons, formal, sterile, and absolute. The Treasury was invoking emergency seizure powers under an obscure section of post-Civil War recovery legislation. All artifacts discovered on Parcel 7B were to be surrendered immediately, pending federal investigation and classification. No negotiation, no appeal, no compromise. The letter bore no signature, just a typed name, Special Liaison, Henry C. Sutter. Earl read it once, then again, slower. He said nothing, folded it carefully, and placed it next to Rourke's journal on the kitchen table. Dr. Bryce exhaled hard through his nose. This isn't just about the gold anymore. They're trying to erase the narrative before it becomes public record. Marley nodded. We've forced their hand. Earl leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the wood grain beneath his fingers. Let 'em come. They came 2 days later, 3 black SUVs, 2 sedans with dark windows, a single unmarked helicopter circling like a hawk over an open field. Sutter arrived with the cold demeanor of a man who'd long since forgotten what it meant to knock. He stepped out of the lead vehicle, trim suit crisp even under the New Mexico sun, briefcase in one hand, sealed file in the other. He didn't offer his name. Earl didn't ask for it. Instead, Sutter surveyed the property like a ranch appraiser, or, more truthfully, a vulture. Marley stood nearby with a camera phone filming discreetly from behind her sunglasses. Bryce approached with copies of the historical filings and pending court injunctions. Sutter didn't touch the papers. I'm here under federal authority, he said, voice even. This property contains classified material. All contents are now considered restricted historical evidence. And if we don't comply? Earl asked. Sutter offered a tight smile. You'll be escorted off your land, and the site will be secured under federal jurisdiction. Any interference will be treated as obstruction. Bryce stepped forward, papers in hand. We've already filed with the National Historic Preservation Office, and the American Historical Trust has requested congressional oversight. If you move without a warrant, you'll face public inquiry and federal counter-litigation. Sutter glanced around. You think public opinion will save you? Earl finally rose from his chair. No, he said, but the truth might. Sutter's lips tightened. You don't own that truth. Earl looked at him, slow and hard. I don't have to. It's already out. That night, Linda Grace dropped her next piece, title, The Treasury, the Tracks, and the Truth, Civil War Gold and the Machinery of Silence. It cited everything, the documents, the letters, the recordings. She named names, including Sutter's. She referenced the sealed crates and the ledger entries, showing how the stolen gold was funneled through shell railroad companies, then into early Wall Street firms, names that still carried weight. The article included scanned documents, telegrams between Union generals and Treasury officials, property transfers signed under assumed names, and a map showing exactly how the gold moved westward and disappeared under Dry Creek. It was the story no classroom ever told, and now it couldn't be untold. The next morning, Earl's lawyer arrived, Vivian Hardin, 65, with iron gray hair and a courtroom reputation built on chewing up federal overreach for breakfast. She didn't greet Sutter when she entered. She simply placed a stack of filings on the kitchen table. You move that gold, she said coldly, and I'll have 3 judges in Santa Fe screaming about historical suppression before lunch. Sutter stared at her for a long moment. You're bluffing. I'm billing, she replied. But pressure mounted from all sides. The phones at the ranch rang non-stop. Reporters, veterans groups, families of displaced settlers, archivists, conspiracy theorists. Some called to offer support, others to warn them, a few to threaten. Someone hacked Marley's email. Bryce's university suspended him pending an internal review. Linda was issued a formal legal threat from a federal law firm citing irresponsible publication of sensitive national history. Even the sheriff returned, unannounced. He didn't speak, just stood by the fence for 20 minutes, staring at the house, then left. Earl said nothing, but inside, he moved the gold coins and Rourke's pistol from the vault to a hidden compartment in the root cellar. Not to hide them, to protect them from history's undertaker. That night, Earl sat alone in the parlor with Clara's wedding ring resting in his palm. He thought of all the things that had been stolen from people like them, not just gold, but roots, land, story, dignity. The kind of quiet robbery that doesn't need a gun, just a signature. He thought of Rourke, the Union soldier who risked his life to bury the evidence. He thought of the nameless men who buried the truth again a generation later. And he thought of the little kids who now came on field trips, standing where once only silence had grown. He made his decision. The next morning, Earl held a press conference. He handed the gold over to the federal agents, with cameras flashing, reporters recording, and half the county watching. Then he stepped up to the microphone and held up the bundle of letters. "These," he said, "stay here." "They're not yours," Sutter barked. "They're not yours either," Earl replied. "The gold belongs to the government, but the truth belongs to the people." The gold was gone. Escorted out of Dry Creek in armored vans under federal supervision, it disappeared into the same bureaucratic machine that once buried it beneath a fireplace in the middle of nowhere. There were no cheers, no celebration, just the hollow quiet that settles when something heavy leaves a place it never should have touched. But what remained, letters, journals, photographs, relics, was worth far more. Earl Whitman stood in the center of the old ranch house, hammer in one hand, picture frame in the other. The scent of linseed oil and fresh pine filled the air. Behind him, the once crumbling walls now stood upright, sanded, painted, and warm. The burnt floorboards had been replaced with wide-cut oak from a nearby mill. New windows let the morning sun stream through, catching dust motes that danced like tiny echoes of history itself. The barn had not been rebuilt. It had been reimagined. Where hay bales and rusted tools once gathered cobwebs, there were now displays, war-era currency, faded maps, journals under glass, and Rourke's insignia mounted beside a placard that read, "Operation Scorpion, a hidden war within a war." Marley called it the Museum of the Forgotten, and Dry Creek had never seen anything like it. They came slowly at first. A local teacher brought her fourth-grade class, curious and fidgety. A widower from Roswell stopped by after reading Linda's article online. Then came a veteran in his 70s, cane in hand, tears in his eyes when he saw the name of a friend long thought lost, now mentioned in one of Rourke's letters. By the end of the month, the parking lot needed gravel. Linda and Rosalia managed the front desk, keeping the registry, selling coffee, organizing donations. Dr. Bryce gave free lectures twice a week, filling the air with context and clarity. But it was Marley who turned the ranch into a living classroom. She moved into the guest house out back and began curating the archives. She categorized over 300 documents and artifacts in the first 90 days. She partnered with local schools, brought in high school students to learn about preservation, truth-telling, and the layers that lie beneath official stories. She called it History Beneath History, and it stuck. Earl never said much during the busy hours. He tended the land, fixed what needed fixing, and made sure the porch light was always on. Every evening, he walked through the barn, touching each exhibit like a man checking on sleeping children. He placed his hand on Rourke's map the way a pastor might touch scripture, carefully, reverently. One Saturday, a boy no older than 9 stood silently in front of the silver-plated pistol inside the glass case. "Was that yours?" he asked Earl. Earl chuckled. "No, son. That belonged to a man who knew truth was worth hiding until someone could find it." The boy nodded slowly. "Did it make him a hero?" Earl paused, then said, "No. It made him honest." The letters kept coming, from Ohio, Georgia, Pennsylvania, families who had found their surnames in the registry. One woman from Maryland brought in her grandfather's diary, which included a page copied word for word from Rourke's journal. A young man from Dallas uncovered property records that matched the stolen land plots from the Operation Clayroot files. For every artifact recovered, a memory was restored, and for every name remembered, a silence was broken. Marley created a digital archive. Donations poured in, universities reached out. One professor called it the most complete non-governmental Civil War financial archive in the country. Another dubbed Earl's Museum a reclamation project for buried American truths. But Earl didn't care about titles or rankings. He cared that the barn was no longer empty, that the land, once dismissed as jinxed, now spoke, that people came, not just to learn, but to remember. Rosalia sat beside him one afternoon as they watched the wind roll through the grass behind the museum, her hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. "My father would have smiled at this," she said. "He always believed the land kept secrets, not to keep them hidden, but to make sure they had the right moment to rise." Earl nodded. Guess this was the moment. With a small portion of the settlement money, His share after the court recognized the value of the records, Earl established a trust. He called it the Clay Root Fund, its sole mission to fund rural education on suppressed American history. The first school to receive a grant was in Ellis County, Oklahoma, where Clara had grown up. He had the letter announcing the award framed and hung in the ranch house kitchen. Beside it, he placed a photo of Clara smiling in the wheat fields. One quiet morning, Earl was sitting at the window with a fresh cup of coffee when Marley walked in with a stack of letters. "You got something here," she said, holding out a cream-colored envelope. No return address. Inside, a folded note in careful cursive. "Thank you for giving us back what was stolen." Not the gold, the story. No name, just a pressed violet, dried and delicate. Earl smiled, not the kind of smile that stretches wide, but the kind that settles behind the eyes and lingers like a warm fire. The fireplace had changed. It no longer held the heat of burning logs or the crackle of wood splitting in flame. Instead, it held history. Encased behind thick, museum-grade glass, its once charred bricks were now cleaned and stabilized, the loose stone left slightly tilted in place, unchanged, untouched, like it was still waiting to tell the next person its secret. Years had passed since Earl Whitman first pried that stone loose and cracked open a story long buried by silence. Since then, Dry Creek had changed, not in a loud, booming kind of way, but slowly, with the steady patience of land that had learned to wait. The ranch house had become more than a house. It had become a symbol, a classroom, a sanctuary for the truth. School buses rolled up every other Saturday, dust trailing behind them like memory, unloading groups of wide-eyed kids onto the gravel drive. They came with questions, with curiosity, with notebooks and water bottles and digital cameras. Some left changed, some didn't understand, but all of them felt something, even if they didn't know what to name it yet. Earl still lived there. He no longer worked the land like he used to. His knees had stiffened, his hands had curled slightly with age, but his eyes, those remained sharp enough to catch every shimmer of sun off the barn roof, every flicker of wind across the wheatgrass. That afternoon, he sat beside the glass-enclosed hearth, an old wool blanket pulled across his knees, a thermos of black coffee cooling slowly in his hand. His chair creaked in rhythm with the breeze tapping against the window panes. Behind him, the room was quiet, except for the sound of soft footsteps and the occasional whisper from a student passing through. A group of children paused in front of the fireplace, giggling and nudging each other as they tried to find the secret stone. One boy, freckled and serious beyond his years, turned to Earl. "Is it true?" he asked. "All of it?" Earl didn't answer right away. He reached into his front pocket, the canvas soft from years of wear, and pulled out something small, rusted, smooth at the edges. He held it in his open palm, the union button. "This," he said, "was buried under ash and lies for over 100 years. It's not much to look at, is it?" The boy shook his head. "But it's real," Earl added. "And sometimes, that's more powerful than any story we could make up." He handed it to the boy for just a moment. Let him feel its weight. Truth don't always shine, but it never breaks. Marley Tate didn't live in Dry Creek anymore. She still visited the ranch when she could, always staying in the little guest house Earl had helped her fix up during the early days of the museum. But most of her time was spent traveling now, colleges, symposiums, historical societies. She'd become one of the country's foremost experts on hidden Civil War intelligence operations, the kind of speaker who got standing ovations in places where professors wore tweed and students paid attention. But no matter how big the venue, no matter how formal the stage, she always started her talk the same way. It all started with one stubborn old man and a broken stone. The audience always laughed. Then they leaned in. Rosalia had passed away the year before, quietly, in her sleep, with a breeze at her window and a photo of her father tucked into the Bible beside her bed. The museum held a memorial for her under the cottonwood tree. Marley planted lavender around its base, and Earl placed one of Rourke's letters beneath a stone at the roots. Linda Grace published a book, The Clay Root Ledger. It hit the bestseller list for 10 weeks and became required reading in several universities. But she rarely spoke publicly about Dry Creek. When asked, she'd only say, "Some stories aren't about telling, they're about listening." Inside the barn, one wall had become a patchwork of black and white photos. Descendants, soldiers, farmers, freedmen, women and children, some named, some not, each with a small plaque bearing a year, a place, and a few carefully chosen words. Beneath that wall was a long bench where people sat for a while. They didn't talk. They just sat. You could tell the ones who knew what it meant. You could see it in their silence. One evening, the last school bus pulled away and left the ranch to its dusk. The air held the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for anything. Earl stepped out onto the porch, blanket around his shoulders, and lowered himself into the old rocker Clara had once picked out from a flea market 30 years back. The hills glowed orange. Red Mesa caught the last light like a flame holding its breath. The sky was wide, and the wind began to rise, slowly at first, then fuller. It moved through the wheatgrass in waves, rolled across the sandstone ridges, then swept down through the barn, lifting bits of dust into the air. Earl closed his eyes. He heard Clara's laugh in the rustle of the wind chimes. He saw Rourke's handwriting in the twist of a cloud. He felt the earth beneath him, steady as ever, unchanged, and yet completely different. In his hand, the Union button lay warm from his touch. He didn't hear Marley's voice until morning. She'd arrived late, found the house dark but the porch light still on. Earl was in his chair, blanket pulled to his chest, chin resting on his collarbone, the button clutched gently in one hand. She didn't cry. She just sat beside him, said nothing for a long time. Then she whispered, "I'll keep telling it, Earl." "I promise." They buried him under the cottonwood next to Clara. The marker was plain, like he would have wanted. A small flat stone that read, Earl Whitman. He didn't own the truth. He let it live. Marley placed the button beneath the soil. Let it go one last time. The wind rushes through Dry Creek, over fields now tall and golden, across the low stone walls of the museum. It sweeps the gravel paths, the glass of the fireplace, the cottonwood leaves. It rattles the loose tin on the old well shed and whistles between the rafters of the barn. It moves over the sandstone hills, and somewhere in that wind, maybe in the hush, maybe in the hum, there are voices, not loud, not begging to be heard, just there. And this time, someone's listening.